family heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today as we broadcast from KJNP here in North Pole, Alaska. Looking forward to this opportunity to meet a number of individuals up here in Alaska, and certainly very grateful for what we've been able to do in terms of this broadcast. But over the next 2 hours, we're going to be looking at a number of issues in the news. We'll also be doing some interviews. Chad Hufford will be with us as we talk about some financial issues. A new voice to our listeners will be Abdullah Hayek, who will be talking to us about some issues in the Middle East, specifically about what's happening with Israel and Syria. And really, if you think about it, over this first hour, our general topic will be about changes in our culture. If there's one thing that you can probably agree with, it seems to me that one of the constants in our world is change. And so we're going to be talking about that. Certainly we'll talk about some of the changes in the financial world, but I thought I'd start off with a piece that comes from the former senator and university president Ben Sasse. It is our first article on our website, and you can find it there as you go through some of the material, because if nothing else, we really want to begin to think about some of the changes. And he starts off by talking about the end of Stephen Colbert and late-night television. He says Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are certain that Stephen Colbert is the victim of politics. And he says it's true that the late-night show has been #1 program in its format, in its slot, for the legacy networks. But he says that that's a load of disqualifiers for a show, interestingly enough, that hardly anybody watches anymore. And the argument is that what has happened, according to Ben Sasse, who is an individual that served in the United States Senate and also university president, love to have him on the program again, is that in some respects YouTube has replaced late-night television. And I think that is really one of those changes that we're going to be talking about over the next couple of months, because when you take a program that was in the Ed Sullivan Theater, one that was inherited from David Letterman and others before that, and the decision was not just to cancel the guest and the host, but to cancel the entire late show itself. I think it's, if nothing else, kind of a cultural phenomenon that has changed, and an illustration, again, that that is the case. Now, Ben Sasse is honest enough to say that Stephen Colbert does deserve criticism for turning this segment into something that was highly politicized, and also generated probably a smaller viewing audience. But the point he makes is that here you have a program that was, quote, #1 in the ratings, and now CBS is deciding that they're going to mothball it. And if you think about it, it was not doing as well as Gutfeld on the Fox evening show, which is on cable, and yet here this is on the so-called legacy media. And I think it just illustrates again that there are just so many changes taking place. But what I thought was interesting is if you have an individual like Ben Sasse, who went to Harvard, graduated from Oxford, he also takes the time to say that in some respects this illustrates a bigger problem that we talk about here on Point of View so often, and that is we used to have a united America. Oh, yes, we had a civil war. Yes, there have been conflicts between the rich and the poor, Republicans, Democrats, but we still had sort of a united society of sorts. And yet, interestingly enough, he reminds us, if you go back to Federalist Paper #2, the writers there, and that would be, of course, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, talked about the fact that Americans were a united people speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government. And that doesn't exactly happen anymore. And so for those of us that are older, and he uses the example of maybe baby boomers and Generation X, they found that there was sort of a uniting factor, whether it was late-night television, whether it was, of course, the landing on the moon, whether it was later on the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, and on and on and on, to the time now that the younger generation, and we're going to be hearing from some of them a little bit later, one of the younger voices for millennials and Gen Z, they are dealing with a much more fragmented America, but also a fragmented media ecosystem. And if nothing else, just a reminder that we don't really have that common culture that we would like to have. And it's a good illustration that we are living in a new world. And one of the reasons why we oftentimes address that new world is because it is going to affect not only you, but your children and your grandchildren. And a reminder that in some respects we're in a very different kind of world that we see ourselves in. But let's, if we can, also get to another piece that I've posted, because a lot of what we're going to be talking about today will be finances. And who would have predicted, certainly even this time last year, that you would have such criticism of the Federal Reserve. And so you have the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, who, as one author says, wants to go to war with the Federal Reserve and not happy with the way it is operating. During an interview on CNBC the other day, the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, said that he essentially wants to audit the Fed. That's something we heard from people like Ron Paul, and then later his son Rand Paul. And here we are seeing that as people are starting to have some really significant questions. But if I could quote from the Treasury Secretary for just a minute, he says, "What we need to do is examine the entire Federal Reserve institution and whether they have been successful." Because when we talk about this particular group of individuals there, he says that they deal with monetary policy, they deal with regulations, financial stability, and the rest. But he says, I think that the organization should really succeed. And the example that the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, used was simply this. If there were the FAA and we were having this many mistakes, we would go back and look at it and say, why has this happened? And then he actually even took a shot and say, you know, we have an institution full of PhDs, but it's almost like we're just paying them to do no work. And he says, if you look at this, there are fear-mongering over tariffs, which we'll talk about after the break, but thus far we've seen very little inflation. So he says, I think the idea that you're not going to break out of a certain mindset is simply not going to work. And so he even goes on later on to talk about the fact that we have individuals who maybe aren't even as economically as sophisticated as our current president, another shot across the bow, which illustrates again that, as we'll talk a little bit later with Chad Hufford, we are dealing with kind of a different economic set of circumstances. And so we will come back and spend some time also with him in just a few minutes talking about how we react to that, how we manage that, how we manage even some of the fear that comes from that as well. So when we come back, I do want to talk a little bit about some of these tariffs, because that was one of the things that kind of set off Scott Bessent. Then we're going to talk with Chad Hufford about some of the financial issues, because after all, that's very important for us as individuals to think through. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to read some of these articles that you're quoting from, you can simply go to the website pointofview.net and you will find those articles. Click on that button that says see more. My Viewpoints commentary today also relates to the economic issues. The number of young people who say, I cannot own a home, and what that means and why that is something, again, that really gets back to some of these key financial issues that we talk about so often here on Point of View. Let's take a break, though. Broadcasting live from KJNP. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Owning a home has been a foundational principle of the American dream. Unfortunately, fewer Americans can own a home. Now, the topic surfaced during a speech Tucker Carlson gave at a recent Turning Point USA conference. He said that economics really matter, not because the rich are getting richer, but because everyone else is getting poorer. He rejected the idea of measuring the economy by citing our GDP. Instead, he proposed another measure. He said, my measure is really simple. I got a bunch of kids. Can they afford houses with full-time jobs at age 27? The answer is no way. And the answer is that 35-year-olds with really good jobs can't afford a house unless they stretch and go deep into debt. He called our current circumstances a total disaster for two reasons. One, if people don't own things, they don't feel ownership of the country they're in. And the country gets super volatile because people feel like they've got nothing to lose. When you have a lawn, trust me, you're thinking long term. Second, it's really hard to have a family without a house. There is also, of course, the psychological damage this does to younger Americans. He called this a national emergency because normal people with normal jobs no longer believe that they can win in this system and that all the money is going to the worst people. He isn't the only person talking about the fact that fewer Americans can own a home, but many more pundits and politicians need to speak out. Sadly, too many people in positions of leadership benefit from our debt-based fiat economy. It rewards people who have assets and punishes everyone else. The first step to fixing this problem is to first admit that it is a problem. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, broadcasting live from KJNP. I might just mention that a number of people have shown up to the radio station here watching the broadcast, and we're so grateful that they are here, and we look forward to spending some time with them after the program, having some lunch and getting us a chance to interact. But let me, if I can, continue on this issue of economics. And even today and yesterday, I had some people say, you always bring such bad news, but you always have a smile on your face. Well, let me bring you some good news, and there is quite a bit when we come to the trade wars. And that is, after a meeting with the Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., name is probably very familiar to you, the president announced that the Philippines agreed to drop all tariffs on U.S. goods, expand military cooperation and imports from the Philippines to America, and that they would be subject to a 19% tariff, raising additional revenue for the United States. Every time that I've been to the Philippines, it has been an opportunity to really get to know individuals there that are very appreciative of the United States, and here is another good example of a trade deal that's gone the right direction with the Philippines. But not to be outdone, later President Trump then met with the Indonesian president and Prabowo Subianto, and following that meeting, Donald Trump announced that Indonesia would eliminate its 99% trade barriers on industrial, high-tech, and agricultural products, also agreed to some major contracts worth, again, best estimates are tens of billions of dollars in trade. And again, in this particular case, Indonesian imports to the United States will be subject to a 19% tariff. But if that was not enough, again, quite the showman, President Trump left the best for last, and that is to announce the biggest trade deal ever with Japan. And this is one which is pretty amazing indeed. The article I've got from the Wall Street Journal, and remember, they aren't always necessarily always favorable to everything Donald Trump has been doing, in particular tariffs. Nevertheless, announced that President Trump announced that Japan's trade deal was good news on the news. He hailed this with, again, they jokingly say, with his characteristic modesty, perhaps the biggest deal ever made. But nevertheless, this new trade tariff rate is good news, only as a relief from, again, the 25% that we were talking about before. There's still a 15% tax increase on imports from Japan, but we'll see where that all unfolds in terms of some of the agricultural issues as well. But I think, if nothing else, one very positive development is an apparent reduction in U.S. auto tariffs from 25%. And so that is certainly going to be helpful for individuals that they talk about. If you want some of the details, of course, you can find that in some of the articles. But I thought it was interesting that Japan has agreed to buy 100 Boeing planes, increase imports of U.S. rice by 75%, also to buy an additional $8 billion in agricultural products, and increase defense contracts with U.S. companies by at least $3 billion. So if nothing else, if you were looking for some positive news, there it is. And for people that have said tariff, or at least the threats of tariffs don't work, I would again recognize that those have. The more difficult ones are on the horizon. Then we'll move on to my commentary today, and that is that now we're talking about dealing with our trading partners in the European Union. In some respects, it probably is fair to say that Japan was a little easier because, in some respects, the real sticking point between the U.S. and Japan had to do with agricultural protectionism. We would like to sell rice. Of course, they produce rice themselves, but nevertheless, that is the case. Now, when we deal with the European Union in particular and those bureaucrats in Brussels, we're talking about all sorts of issues because you have tech, pharma, and a variety of others that are there, and even some of the complaints about the financial regulations of America and America's criticism of some of the censorship that takes place as well. But I thought I'd try to bring it back for just a few minutes to what that means to you. The focus so often on point of view is, how does it affect your faith, your family, or your freedom? Sometimes we see individuals on various talk shows talk about things that are interesting, and we're going to be talking about next hour Middle East, and that's kind of interesting. You want to know sort of what's happening in Israel and Syria, but how does it affect you? When we talk about these economic issues, it really gets down to one of the things that I've written today in my commentary, which is the whole issue of owning a home. Because I point out that really owning a home, if you wanted to actually talk about what I might consider to be a foundational principle in the American dream, it is that. Yet the harsh reality is we went from a time when the so-called builder generation of those who were part of the Great Generation and the Boomer generation were able to own homes to a time today when millennials are saying, I'm not sure I'll ever own a home. And some of that has to do, again, with things like the Federal Reserve, the fact that we've printed more money, the fact that the cost of goods have gone up. And as a result, the salaries have not gone up, so people with assets certainly have done well, but the people that live day to day haven't done so well. And so we have a very difficult set of circumstances that have unfolded. And I quote from Tucker Carlson, not that we always agree with everything Tucker Carlson had to say, but he was recently at the Turning Point USA conference, which is held by, of course, our good friends that are out there as well. And so he was talking about the fact that he believes that economics really matters and wanted to try to help people understand why, in some respects, they need to focus on economics and why, quite frankly, we spent a fair amount of time here on Point of View lately talking about economics because, as Tucker Carlson said, and Charlie Kirk I think would agree, that rich are becoming richer and everyone else is getting poorer. And, of course, that's one of the reasons why we look at things like inflation and like money printing and the Federal Reserve and a variety of others. But Tucker Carlson said, I get tired of people trying to tell me that we're doing well because I look at GDP, because he says my measure is really simple. I got a bunch of kids. Can they afford houses with full-time jobs at age 27? And he says the answer is no way. And the answer is even 35-year-olds with really good jobs can't afford a house unless they stretch and go deep into debt. He then points out that some people do have houses because their parents have helped them, and he said that's great. But he says this constant tendency for younger and younger people not to own homes, he describes as a total disaster for two reasons. Again, quoting back Tucker Carlson, he says, first, if people don't own things, they don't feel ownership of the country they're in. And he believes that that makes the country more volatile because they feel like they've got nothing to lose. And he says, if you have a lawn, trust me, you're thinking long terms. And I thought that was kind of a good line. But second of all, he also says it's really hard to have a family without a house. He says, sure, we know people that have raised children in an apartment, but it isn't ideal. And if you are trying to raise children in apartments, you're probably going to have fewer children. Of course, we see the decline in population. But he also talked about what this is in terms of just the psychological damage to younger Americans. He called this a national emergency simply because normal people with normal jobs no longer believe they can win in this system and that all the money is going to the worst people. And so, as we've said on Point of View so many times, there are solutions to this problem, but part of the problem is you aren't referring to it as a problem. And if you think about that, how few maybe politicians, pundits, and others are talking about the fact that this is a very important issue. And I'll be the first to admit that Tucker Carlson and Charlie Kirk at the Turning Point System, and even some of us around here at Point of View, aren't the only ones talking about the fact that fewer Americans can own a home. But the sad reality is a lot of people in positions of leadership oftentimes benefit from this debt-based fiat economy. And it rewards people who have assets, and it really punishes everyone else. And so the first step, I think, to fixing a problem is being willing to admit it, that it exists in the first place. So that's one of the reasons why ever since this last decade or so on Point of View, we've talked about economics. We recognize that is of concern. If you look at the median family income and then look at the median house price in America, you can see that there is a very significant gap. And it's one of the reasons why my commentary today is about owning a home. And if you don't receive my daily commentaries, let me just mention that you can click on that button that says Read Now. There's a button then that says Never Miss a Viewpoints commentary. Mine would come to you Monday through Friday. Penedexter's comes to you on Saturday, and I would encourage you that if you'd like to read this or maybe pass it on to others, that is certainly one of many resources we would love to put in your hands as well. We come back, though, we're going to talk about the whole issue of finance with Chad Hufford, and all that coming up right after these important messages.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer. And that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, broadcasting from KJNP in North Pole, Alaska. Going to spend some time now talking with an individual that you've heard on this program before, and a very good friend of this ministry, Chad Hufford, who was born and raised in Anchorage, Alaska. And even though we're up here in the northern part of Alaska and he's down in the southern part of Alaska, I thought it would be good to connect up with him. One, because we're in Alaska. Two, because we've been talking about some of these financial issues. And first of all, as you have probably heard us talk about before, he's the second of three generations that have been listening to Point of View. His mother listened to Point of View. He listens to Point of View. His kids listen to Point of View. He's also the author of a book I highly recommend. It's on the website right now, Forging Financial Freedom, Constructing Blue-Collar Millionaires with 7 Wealth-Building Lessons Extracted from the Alaska Oil Field. So, again, as we're in Alaska right now, I thought it would be great for you to hear from him. Might just also mention he's with Veritas Wealth Management. We have a link there. And so, Chad, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, as always, it is a pleasure speaking with you. I wish we could be there with you in person, and it almost worked out perfectly. We're going to be up north next week doing an event for Golden Valley Electric in Healy, which is just a little bit south of where you're at, but almost perfect doesn't work. So, but glad to join you via phone, but wish we could be there in studio.
Well, I always love when I come to Alaska, especially when we go to Anchorage, to come and see you and spend time with you and your wife, Tiffany, your kids, and everything is always a lot of fun. But I thought, let's get into it, because one of the things you've been talking about lately is how people are making maybe poor financial decisions based upon fear. Now, let me set the stage. We just talked about tariffs just a minute ago. Right after the president announced some of these tariffs, we saw the stock market just drop like a rock. But one of the principles you learn in your book is, don't react instantaneously, because it then kind of had a U-shaped return very quickly once the stock market recognized the issues associated with that. But whether we're talking about tariffs, whether we're talking about some of the other issues in the economy right now, it does seem to me that we need to provide individuals with a little bit of comfort and a little bit of compassion and a learning that maybe persistence and careful decision making is a lot better than the rash decisions some people have been making in the stock market lately. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. And I think fear has always been a part of the investing process for many people. Unfortunately, the financial media magnifies it. And I don't mean this to be offensive to anybody, but the financial media is not there to make anybody a better steward of their finances. It's there to get you worked up emotionally, and fear is usually the best way to do that, greed being number 2. But in both instances, it's getting people to react emotionally rather than acting on a rational long-term strategy. And the matter of fact is you'll learn about as much as good financial stewardship watching financial media as you will learn about marriage watching pornography. And again, I don't mean that to offend anybody, but that's really the truth of it. It sensationalizes and magnifies wealth and finances, which I believe God created for us to bless others, just like pornography sensationalizes and exaggerates human sexuality, which also God created to be a blessing to others. But we've misused both of those areas, and the financial media just preys upon our natural human emotion and gets us to put all our energy and effort into the things that we can't control. And so often we end up missing the things that we can control.
One of the things that you talk about in terms of the wealth building lessons actually harkens back to the fact that you're in very good shape and you've worked in a fitness center, and even to this day, even though you are doing financial planning, talk about that. And anybody that wants to build muscle or wants to lose weight recognizes that crash diets or a quick fix is not the way to get a healthy lifestyle. And if you've taken those principles oftentimes from fitness gurus and applied them to finances. And I think if people really want to forge financial freedom, which is the title of your book, you need to come back to recognize it's a step-by-step plan. Starts with a budget and starts with making those incremental steps, doesn't it?
It does, and it's a long process. And people need to focus on sustainability more than trying to optimize a process. So at least initially, and you mentioned fitness. So just think about how busy a gym is on January 1st or January 2nd, probably. They're downloading workouts that Special Forces uses, even though they haven't been in the gym in 20 years, and they wonder why they burn out in a week or 2 weeks or maybe 20 minutes. And this isn't about trying to get rich quick. It's about building wealth slowly and sustainably with good biblically based stewardship principles, but it is a long process. And there's a lot of storms that people are going to have to endure, both personal, might be family health issues or loss of the job, or it might be global issues like the tariff tantrums that you talked about, or the global financial crisis 15 years ago, or COVID 5 years ago, the dot-com bubble burst 25 years ago. I mean, just in the last quarter century, we've had probably half a dozen or more major, potentially cataclysmic events that people have had to weather through. And it's hard to stick to your guns and still work on a plan and apply those good stewardship principles in the midst of a world who mismanages finances every moment of every day.
It does seem to me, too, that one of the individuals that you've interacted with many times is Dave Ramsey, and you actually have been a top-ranked financial planner and recognize that he is telling people that there are some obvious first steps, and one is to have a budget, because a budget is where you tell the money where to go rather than the money that goes and you wonder where it went. And then number two, of course, getting out of debt. And we're talking to, and next hour we'll be talking to another one of those young voices, a whole generation, a Generation Y, Generation Z. Now they're talking about Generation Alpha, and they are going to have to be even more paying attention to budget and to figure out where they want to put their investments, because if they don't, they're going to probably have an even more difficult time eventually wanting to own a home, having resources so that they can send their kids to college, or having resources so eventually they can retire. So it seems to me that that's always been important, but it seems to me it's even more important with this generation, don't you think?
Well, and it's also more countercultural because fewer and fewer people are living intentionally with their finances. And one of the questions I get asked on radio and other podcasts and things like that is, what is the number one secret to building wealth? And I say, it's quite simple. It's living within your means. And people will tell me, well, okay, we know that, but what else? Well, if you're not doing that, nothing else matters. It doesn't matter how good your investment strategy is if you can't fund it because you're busy paying off things that you bought months or years ago, and literally paying for past mistakes, spending money you don't have to buy things you don't need to impress people you don't even like. So if people can't get their day-to-day budget under control, everything else falls apart. The financial planning, the investing, the paying down debt. And it's so simple, but simple is not always easy. And that's why Dave Ramsey has a huge radio show, because people need that constant encouragement. And just real quick, Kerby, if I might just go back to the fear aspect too. When
Sure.
you're living in debt, you realize it or not, you're starting out every month giving your first fruits to a bank or to a mortgage company or to a car company. You're giving away your first fruits to somebody else. That triggers a significant amount of anxiety, even if you're not aware of it. Those fears, those emotions are stewing in the background of your life, and it creates a more fear-based reaction to other financial circumstances, which might be political things. It might be, speculation about what's happening in the stock market or with interest rates. It doesn't matter what it is. It makes you more reactive if your current financial life is out of control. And that's why Dave Ramsey says what happens, at least as it pertains to your family's financial security, what you do in your house is far more important than what happens in the White House.
The other thing I love about that is you were talking about first fruits, and as we're going to a break, I'll just mention real quickly, our first fruits should be going to the Lord. So, again, don't matter what situation you find yourself in, and both Chad and I have had the same kind of value that even when we didn't have the kind of financial resources that we have access to today, we always felt that the first fruits always go to the Lord and to your church and to maybe the radio station that carries that. Hopefully you might even consider supporting Point of View. But when we come back, I want to get into a couple of issues as well, because we are seeing individuals that are saying, well, if I keep money in the bank, I'm just losing ground because it's like a melting ice cube. So if I do have some resources that I could invest, what would be some logical ways to use that? But most importantly, as you've talked about here, don't let fear-based decisions ruin your finances. We'll continue with Chad Hufford right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Chad Hufford as we broadcast today from KJNP in North Pole, Alaska. He's located in Anchorage. If you'd like to know more about him, you can go to the website and click on his picture. That will take you to their website, which I think you will appreciate, and learn a little bit more about veritasalaska.com. And then, of course, there is a link there to his book. You can get it both in paperback and Kindle, and it is, again, something I thought was so appropriate since the subtitle of the book, Forge Managing Financial Freedom was about some of these lessons extracted from the Alaska oil field. And since we're broadcasting in Alaska, I thought you'd appreciate some of the ideas that he has there. But let me, if I can, for just a minute, Chad, come back to this concern for the younger generation, and I'll be talking to one of the young voices next hour who are saying, I'd like to own a house, but I'm really struggling with that. But it does seem to me that if you were to say, well, I'll just take my money and put it in the bank, the problem with that is that even the Federal Reserve tries to have a 2% inflation rate, and frankly, most recently, it seems like the money supply has increased by about 7% each year, and 7%, if you use the basically rule of 72, means about every 10 years the value of your dollars are cut in half. So we do see a real need for people to invest in assets, whether it's a house, whether it's stock, or it's something that is appreciated in value. And that, I think, is, again, something that needs to be part of a person's budget if they want to plan for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. I mean, with interest rates the way they are and with home prices having increased, it's kind of a double whammy. But I do want to encourage younger listeners, even though in their lifetime they've never seen interest rates this high, mortgage rates this high. My mortgage rate, on the first house that we bought almost 20 years ago, this month, I think, actually, was quite a bit higher than they are right now. And in fact, when I was growing up, it was not uncommon to see mortgage rates in the high teens. So I just want to encourage listeners that even though it does seem more of a challenge than it might have been 5, 10, 15 years ago, it can still happen. But kind of going back to what we talked about with debt, people have so much more debt than they did previously. It's really affected their savings rate. So before we worry about return rate, which is what you're alluding to, Kerby, people have to start with savings rate and ratcheting up their savings rate, which might mean cutting back on some things in life. It might be selling that car that you have a loan on and try to get a beater with a heater that you can purchase in cash. Might be cutting out a vacation. I mean, there might be sacrifices, but it's about being intentional about what you want for the future and budgeting in that house, the down payment on that house into your monthly budget. But then to your question about what do you do with the money in the meantime? It really depends on timeline. So if you think you're able to get a down payment together in the next couple of years, a high yield money market is probably the best place for that money to go. But if you have a little bit longer timeline, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years before you think you're going to be able to buy a house, through mutual funds, people have at any wealth level, they have the opportunity to buy some of the best companies in the world, and especially in the United States, through mutual funds. Now, it is volatile, and the reason I said you have to have a little bit longer time horizon is if you put in $2,000 this year into even a well-diversified mutual fund, it might be worth $2,500 next year. It might be worth $1,700 next year. So it doesn't work very well for short-term purchases. But if you have a few years for that money to sit and stew for a little, that's a great way to build up a long-term capital fund for a major purchase.
Well, again, some great ideas that are in your book, but I thought for just a minute, just before I let you go, we might talk politics for just a minute, because I did talk about the fact that we've had this whole issue of tariffs, and then you got Scott Bessent, who is seemingly, along with Donald Trump, challenging the Federal Reserve. And then you even, in the past, had Elon Musk, and a lot of people thought, well, maybe Doge would be a way to cut the cost of government. And he lasted, 135 days. And we just had a rescission package in the Senate that did, let's give them credit, were able to cut $9 billion, $9.4 billion out of future spending, but we're $37 trillion in debt. So it does seem to me that some of the things that we hoped might have been able to turn around the economy in terms of reducing the size and scope of government, maybe reducing or at least trying to get to a balanced budget, don't look like they're in the offing. What are your thoughts? It's
disappointing. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, even in this big, beautiful tax bill, which does have some nice tax benefits, there's over $3 trillion of spending over the next decade worked into that. So although there are some things that I think are going to be great for American businesses and even for individuals, I think the goal of that bill was to essentially out-earn financial mismanagement, to out-earn with increased revenues and in heating up the economy, that we could somehow increase cash flow to cover up poor financial management. And Kerby, you and I both know that doesn't work. It's never worked, and it's not just this current administration. You go back to our founding fathers. One of the worst periods of inflation was in the late 1700s, early 1800s, when we tried to print money to buy our way out of war debt. So it's been an ongoing problem. But like you said, I mean, there's been some cuts here and there, but they seem like a shovel full of dirt getting thrown into the Grand Canyon.
Yes. Well, just before I let you go, I wanted to mention that we do have a link to veritasalaska.com. If nothing else, I would encourage people to go to the website, because not only do they see the building, but they see the beautiful mountains in the background. And so for people that wonder what it's like for you to get up and actually live near one of those mountains and to see those mountains every day, it's a beautiful picture. But there are, I'm sure, probably some people that would like to ask some tough questions, and I certainly recognize that we're not trying to give financial advice here, but I think anybody that has any kind of economic sense knows that saving and getting out of debt and making sure your first fruits go to the Lord are some basics, and I don't think anybody's going to actually have a problem with that, but there are some more difficult issues that people are dealing with, so if they want to contact you, that is the case. And since we were here in Alaska, I just thought it'd be good to chat with you one more time, and as you make your trip up to near where we're broadcasting from today, I hope you and your family do well, and as always, it's great to have you on the program.
Well, Kerby, it's been a pleasure every single time. Really appreciate what you're doing. It's an honor to be a part of it. And just last little bit of encouragement for your audience. I mean, we talked about the spending and the debt, and all those things will contribute to inflation and rising costs. But I just want to encourage people that you still have agency in this. There's a lot you can do to overcome the mismanagement of the world around us and still be a great financial steward. Bless God, bless your family, and bless others with what God has given you.
Very good. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking with Abdullah Hayek. He is one of these young voices, and we've tried to bring some of the young voices on here, talk about the Middle East. Then we're going to talk about what the real risk to the electric grid is, especially since we're up here where there's so much energy, and also a very good piece by our good friend Robert Knight about pastors should be more involved in politics, not less, kind of a counterpoint to a piece that we talked about a couple of weeks ago with our good friend Cal Thomas. So we'll get into that and a variety of other very important topics, but let's take a break. If you would like to know more, visit our website, pointofview.net, and we're broadcasting from KJNP, and we'll be back right after these important messages.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup.
Point of View will continue after this.
Thank you, Kerby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me, and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View, because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today as we broadcast from KJNP in North Pole, Alaska. Let me just mention as program note, we will have our Friday weekend edition tomorrow, but I wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking about what's going on in the Middle East, and I thought this would be an opportunity for you to maybe see a little bit behind the scenes. So we bring to the microphone for the first time Abdullah Hayek. He is an individual that is a Middle East analyst and consultant based in Washington, D.C. As you have heard many times, we bring in various guests from a group called Young Voices, and he is the Middle East History and Peace Fellow at Young Voices. He has been on a number of different broadcasts, and you probably have seen some of his articles in The Hill. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Cal State University, Fullerton, and an MA in international relations with San Francisco State University. And so, Abdullah, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
First time you and I have met, but let's see if we can get to know a little bit more about some of these issues. When we talk about the Middle East, of course, this has been a focus. We've talked about Israel. We've talked about Hamas. We've talked about all the tensions right now, the battle between Israel and Hamas, Israel and Hezbollah. Of course, we've been talking about Israel and the United States bombing the Iranian nuclear facility in Iran. But here is an opportunity to talk about something else, and that is our listeners are probably familiar with what are called the Abraham Accords. And is it possible to actually add additional nations that would actually craft a peace treaty with Israel? And right now, interestingly enough, as I understand it, Syria has a delegation, and a U.S. delegation is meeting with the Syrians and Israelis in Azerbaijan. Can you tell us a little bit more about that development? Because that, I think, is significant.
Of course, Kerby. Since the early days of June, the new government of Ahmad al-Shara, after ousting Bashar al-Assad in Syria, have been talking with the Israelis over the potential of a new peace treaty under the framework of the Abraham Accords. And for about a month, the talks went positively and developments were hitting the headlines. But unfortunately, sectarian strife and violence erupted in the southern province in Syria called Suwaida, which borders Israel. And it erupted between the ethnic Bedouins and the ethnic Druze there. Now, Israel, with a sizable Druze population, felt obligated to intervene and protect the Druze. That put the talks between Syria and Israel at a halt. Now, we are seeing that with the ceasefire announced last week by Ambassador Tom Barak, there's been a renewal of negotiations between Israel and Syria. And as you mentioned, they have met in Baku, Azerbaijan on Tuesday. And today they will actually meet in Paris. And this time it is going to be in the presence of Ambassador Tom Barak to ensure that the negotiations go smoothly and actually bear fruit.
One of the things that I've learned is that there were some military targets in Suwaida as well as Damascus, and that's understandable. I mean, anybody that has ever been to Israel with us, and we actually have tours that we've taken there. I think everybody is very surprised to realize that Israel is about the size of New Jersey, and to the north you have, of course, challenges from Lebanon and Syria and Hezbollah. Of course, to the southwest, of course, is where Hamas is, and that is certainly understandable that some of those actions are taking place. But maybe you can give us, since you are much closer to these issues than I am, whether or not some kind of permanent negotiations or peace could develop, given the fact that you now at least have a ceasefire, and you seem to have some of the major participants and major players all engaged in that particular activity.
Well, most certainly, all the indications point us to the direction that both parties want peace. They don't want an escalation. Ever since the Syrian president assumed power in December till today, all his statements, all his remarks have been reflecting the Syrian policy that they do not want a confrontation with Israel. And the same thing goes to the Israeli verbal side. However, their actions have reflected a different position in the case of Suwaida, and since the fall of Assad in December, Israel has struck targets inside Syria. But they don't do that for the case of striking Syria for Syria. They're doing that because they're still skeptical of this new Syrian government. It is important to note that this new Syrian government has a past with Al-Qaeda. They are remnants of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a splinter of Al-Qaeda, and it is very, uncertain what their policies might be, what their next move is going to be. So Israel, out of precaution, especially in light of its war against Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, as you've mentioned, doesn't want to open another intensive front now with Syria. So on the basic side, they both want peace, but those misunderstandings happen to flare up once in a while. So I think it's most important that the intentions are there, and I hope that we can bear fruit with another peace treaty in the region, because quite frankly, everyone needs one.
Well, let's, if we can, maybe now talk about the influence, and I think it's becoming more significant, of Saudi Arabia. You mentioned, of course, Al-Qaeda. Those would be Sunni Muslims, Saudi Arabia, Sunni Muslims, whereas, of course, when you're talking about, say, Iran, you're talking about Shiite Muslims. But here, it does seem like the Saudis are more active and more involved in what's happening in Syria. Is that true?
Oh, absolutely. They are very much active. In fact, yesterday there was a Saudi-Syrian investment forum in Damascus in which a delegation from Saudi Arabia encompassing of 120 individuals, including 6 billionaires and the Saudi Minister of Investment himself, have already signed deals worth $6.4 billion of reconstruction, of new tech deals, energy in Damascus. And there's also another deal of $100 million skyscraper in Damascus. So this is one of many steps that Saudi is taking to solidify and consolidate its influence, its role, its leadership in the region in general, and in particular in Syria. And the reason it's doing that is because to the north of the Arabian Peninsula, we've had two countries, Syria and Iraq, both ruled by extremely repressive regimes under the Ba'ath Party. When Saddam was ousted in 2003, a few years later, Iran managed to infiltrate the society in Iraq and take over Iraq. Saudi wants to do the same thing in Syria in a post-Ba'athist manner, but it wants to show the world, it wants to show the region that the Saudi model in a post-Ba'athist oppressive regime, the Saudi model is actually going to be a prosperous one, a stable one, a safe one. And they want to expand their reach. I mean, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, is a young man. He's aspiring to have a more global role. He wants to be, this new visionary leader that has these new ideas. And Syria happens to be one of them, and it seems to be successful so far.
Very good. Let's take a break. I've got a few more questions. And again, we're talking with Abdullah Hayek. We have information about him on our website at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Owning a home has been a foundational principle of the American dream. Unfortunately, fewer Americans can own a home. Now, the topic surfaced during a speech Tucker Carlson gave at a recent Turning Point USA conference. He said that economics really matter, not because the rich are getting richer, but because everyone else is getting poorer. He rejected the idea of measuring the economy by citing our GDP. Instead, he proposed another measure. He said, my measure is really simple. I got a bunch of kids. Can they afford houses with full-time jobs at age 27? The answer is no way. And the answer is that 35-year-olds with really good jobs can't afford a house unless they stretch and go deep into debt. He called our current circumstances a total disaster for two reasons. One, if people don't own things, they don't feel ownership of the country they're in. And the country gets super volatile because people feel like they've got nothing to lose. When you have a lawn, trust me, you're thinking long term. Second, it's really hard to have a family without a house. There is also, of course, the psychological damage this does to younger Americans. He called this a national emergency because normal people with normal jobs no longer believe that they can win in this system and that all the money is going to the worst people. He isn't the only person talking about the fact that fewer Americans can own a home, but many more pundits and politicians need to speak out. Sadly, too many people in positions of leadership benefit from our debt-based fiat economy. It rewards people who have assets and punishes everyone else. The first step to fixing this problem is to first admit that it is a problem. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Abdullah Hayek, and again, he is a Middle East analyst and consultant, and one of the fellows with Young Voices, and an expert on Middle East history and peace. And we will certainly encourage you to find out more about him on our website, pointofview.net. But I thought we'd also, just for a minute, Abdullah, come back to that, because the Saudis have invested, again, if I've got that right, $6.4 billion in Syria. And it does remind me of a speech President Trump gave a while back, which, if I can overly simplify it, basically was saying to some of the people in the Middle East, wouldn't you rather make deals than try to kill each other? And I think there's a sense in which the Saudis are starting to say the same kinds of things, that here we can get investments. These are countries that have great potential, and yet these countries are riven with either authoritarian dictators or, if you will, Muslim militancy and things of that nature. I don't believe that we're ever going to completely turn these countries in the Middle East into constitutional republics like the United States, but certainly we can begin to develop peace and began to develop various infrastructure, in this case $6.4 billion of Saudi investment, and that's going to be a good thing for the people that live in Saudi Arabia and live in the area of Syria as well, and certainly beneficial to Israel itself. So these are, I think, positive signs, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think that what we saw with President Trump's visit in May, Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, and to the United Arab Emirates, was just the surface of what potential lies within the development of positive and prosperous relationships between the United States and the moderate, forward-seeing Arab nations in the Gulf and the broader U.S.-supported, U.S.-allied Arab countries in the region. Trump left the Arabian Gulf with the promises of up to $6 trillion worth of deals in fields such as artificial intelligence, tech, energy, arms deals, development. And that's just, the first 6 months of Donald Trump's second administration. So if we can move forward with that formula and keep growing it so it can reach and expand into other countries in the region, we can show that there's a new regional order that is led by the United States, that is supported by its allies in the Arab world, that can make the region great again.
It's amazing. And again, we would encourage our listeners to pray for Israel, pray for the peace of Jerusalem, to pray also for Mike Huckabee, a good friend of this ministry, used to listen to this program when he was a seminary student. Boy, that makes me feel old. But nevertheless, when he was a seminary student listening to Point of View, and Marlon Maddox and myself, and now, of course, now is the U.S. ambassador to Israel. So I think there are some great opportunities. But, Abdullah, before I let you go, let's, if I can, maybe let you make some predictions, because it seems to me that there are some possibilities that other nations could join the Abraham Accords. Can you maybe give us a short list of countries you think might be possible?
I think within the last days of the Trump administration, we are most likely to see 4 Arab countries enter the Abraham Accords framework. They include Saudi Arabia, Syria, Lebanon, and Oman. However, the cherry on top of the sundae in this equation happens to be Saudi Arabia. And Saudi has made it absolutely clear that they will not move forward with normalizing with Israel unless a Palestinian state is established. Now, this comes as part of Saudi Arabia's broader vision to become the victor, the peacemaker, and the deliverer of salvation to the Palestinian people, unlike other Arab peace treaties and normalization deals with Israel that have forsaken or appeared to put the Palestinians on the shelf. So I think the best formula for peace in the region that will be pursued is one that includes broader normalization and peace treaties with Israel, but it also includes the Palestinians. I think it is time that we see people in the Holy Land and the broader Middle East all live in peace and harmony, and I think we can all recognize that the fruits of peace weigh much more on the scale of life than the horrors of war and death. So I hope that the region finds salvation very soon.
Well, Abdullah, it's been great to chat with you, and I would love to get to know you a little bit better next time I'm in Washington, D.C. Maybe we can shake hands, and this was sort of a last-minute addition, but I think it was a great one, and we'd love to use you again because we certainly have been using some of the various individuals associated with Young Voices, and you are one of those. So thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Fantastic. It's been an honor being here, and I look forward to seeing you in person and speaking to our wonderful listeners. Thank you very much.
Let me just mention, just before we take a break, that, of course, what we have to understand is that this could be a positive sign. I think we have to be skeptical, obviously, but one of the commentaries I wrote a while back is where I was quoting from Douglas Murray. If you're not familiar with Douglas Murray, of course, he has been somebody speaking to this whole issue of Islam for some time. He has a new book out called On Democracies and Death Cults. And he basically, at the time, was saying that the country that has been most devastating to Israel has been Iran, because not only, of course, have they used proxies, and that would be Hamas and Hezbollah and even the Houthis, but also they've been spreading this idea that Israel is an expansionist nation, is a colonialist nation, and all the rest. And yet, as a reminder that we maybe need to inject as much truth into this particular region, as well as trying to bring about some level of peace. And he also reminds us that sometimes I have individuals say that they're disappointed the United States and even this program Point of View supports Israel. But I think Douglas Murray has a great quote in which he says, well, if you don't support Israel, then who do you support? Of course, we see young people sometimes in the streets supporting Hamas. But again, if I can quote Douglas Murray, he says, just think of what Hamas is like. He says Palestinian groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and even the Palestinian Authority and others encourage young people to view death through martyrdom as the highest form of valor, and at the same time are saying that the Jewish people are bloodthirsty child killers. There's just so much misinformation out there that it does seem to me that we should do what we can to try to bring that level of truth. One of the booklets I've made available to our donors, and I'd be glad to make it available to you as well, is a booklet on a Christian view, a biblical view on Israel. And one of the reasons we wrote it is because we, after, again, the October 7th attack and massacre by Hamas in Israel, we started seeing all sorts of young people in the streets chanting things like, from the river to the sea, Israel is a racist nation. There's only one solution, it's intifada. We have, of course, an individual right now as a candidate for the governor, it's not the governor, but the mayor of New York City, making some of those same kinds of statements. And I think it's just, important for us to try to counter that. So if you, for example, want to go to school on this, of course, we have a booklet on the whole issue of Islam. We have a booklet on Israel. We even have one more recently on the whole issue of the various kinds of attacks that have been made against individuals based upon Islamic thought and the rest. And so those are some great resources that I think are helpful. But also, just as I was mentioning Douglas Murray's book, which is called On Democracies and Death Cults, the full title of the book is Israel and the Future of Civilization. Because he understands, and I think we understand, that we should recognize that Israel, in some respects, is the very center of the bullseye. But for other countries like Iran, we are also part of that wider circle. They oftentimes talked about the fact that they wanted to destroy the little Satan, that is Israel, and they also wanted to attack and destroy the larger Satan, that is the United States. And so I think Douglas Murray understands, and I think we have people right now in the State Department under Marco Rubio, and we have a president in the Oval Office, Donald Trump, and others that understand that what's at stake is much more than just what's happening to Israel. If what happens in the Middle East blows up, it can affect us even here in this country. So I want you to hear a little bit more about maybe some positive signs coming out of the Middle East. And so in addition to some of the negative, we've given you a couple positives today here on Point of View. Let's take a break. We'll be right back.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again here in KJNP, North Pole, Alaska, and I thought I just might mention that tomorrow we'll have our weekend edition, and Liberty McCarter will actually be hosting it, and you'll have Kelly Shackelford and Jeff Mateer, and I think it's always great to hear from Kelly Shackelford, as you have heard us say before, the head of First Liberty Institute. They've had 9 different cases before the Supreme Court. They've won all 9 cases. That is very rare to even have that many cases before the Supreme Court, even more rare to win those cases, to win the most recent one 9-0, which is pretty amazing. They now have at least one other, and he'll be talking about tomorrow another potential second case that will be going to the Supreme Court. My commentary, as a matter of fact, on that as well, so you can learn a little bit more about some of the legal issues. And the other day I was speaking to a group, and we were talking about the kind of freedom that existed, because this week we were talking about, and last week we were talking about the 100th anniversary of the Scopes trial, and we pointed out that if you go back to 1925, at that time, we had so much more religious liberty than we've had after that period of time because of various decisions that have come down, and I'll leave Carolee to go through some of the details. But we now enjoy a tremendous amount of religious liberty, and a lot of that is due to the work of our friends at First Liberty, also due to our friends at Alliance Defending Freedom. So don't take that for granted. We have greater opportunity now, and we should take advantage of that. So they'll be talking about some of that tomorrow. But since we're in Alaska, I thought I'd talk about energy, and a couple of good reasons for that. First of all, I suspect some of the people that are listening right now here at KJNP have worked on the pipeline. The other day we were talking with somebody talking about the one for a future pipeline for liquid natural gas, and I wanted to post this article, which comes from our friends at the Wall Street Journal, which is about the electric grid, because they are pointing out that the mindset under the Biden administration, that if we're going to have these energy needs, we need more solar and wind. And as much as some of those particular alternative sources of power are good, they are not reliable. And I think we all know that. And in some respects, that gets us into some of the political issues right now, because the editors of the Wall Street Journal put it this way: Democrats are attacking the Republicans' budget bill for phasing out subsidies for wind and solar power, claiming that this will cause power shortages and higher energy rates. I got to hand it to the editors of the Wall Street Journal, because their next sentence is quite true. The evidence suggests the opposite, as a new Energy Department study illustrates. As we've been writing for years, say the editors of the Wall Street Journal, the reliability of the U.S. energy grid is in trouble. The Energy Report projects potential power shortfalls in the year 2030 as 104 gigawatts of baseload power retire in the next 5 years. So again, energy comes online, energy comes offline, and we are going to really begin to address some problems if we don't turn this around. He points out that Americans could lose power in the year 2030 for an average of 34 days, assuming typical weather conditions. If heat waves or storms stress the grid, outages could reach 55 days. Even without plant shutdowns, Americans would lose power for 11 days and amid demand growth. And one of the problems is we are using more energy than ever before for a word or two, maybe 2 words: artificial intelligence, AI. These AI data centers, as we've talked about before, are really demanding more and more energy. And so the energy needs are rising because of these data centers. And as a result, because under the Biden administration we had more and more renewable energy displacing coal and gas, that really caused a problem and will cause a future problem, as my second to the last article that we've posted on the website begins to explain. Why so? Well, it turns out that we had something that was actually called the Inflation Reduction Act. Even President Biden admitted later on that basically that was the Green New Deal, without maybe the change in that, but it sounded really good to be called the Inflation Reduction Act, and as a result it was allocating more and more money to wind and solar that are then distorting all sorts of energy investments. Because these subsidies can offset more than 50% of the project costs, solar and wind became much more profitable. So again, that shows the value of incentives, but it also shows the fallacy of them, because instead of building more gas-fired plants, we were building more solar and wind. And if you think about this, again, solar, wind, and even batteries, which qualify for what they call IRA subsidies, projected to make up, 93% of the new utility scale electric capacity this year. So what we're building are the very things that are less reliable, and so as a result, that is going to be really difficult for people in the future. They go on to then simply say that the renewable lobby claims that these new gas plants can't be built in time to meet rising power demands, so the argument goes. So the taxpayers must subsidize wind and solar to meet electric demands. But if that is true, why did we have these subsidies in the first place? Well, nevertheless, you can begin to see what the problem is. That is, if you want to make sure we have power for the future, you don't want your lights to go off. You can see this is an energy project that has been evaluated over these last few months and illustrate again that we went down the wrong road. What are the solutions? Well, you might remember what candidate Donald Trump said: build, burn, as well as drill, baby, drill, and all the rest. So build more plants, drill more oil and gas, and do what you can to begin to turn some of this around. The claim, of course, that they say that tax credits reduce electrical rates is really contradicted by some of us that actually live in places where there's a fair amount of wind power. One of those, tomorrow we'll be going back to the state of Texas, and in Texas right now residential power prices have risen 40%. And so again, I appreciate that some of the power that we receive in when we broadcast Point of View comes from these big wind turbines that are to the west of us. The reality is it's actually become more expensive, even though we were being told that it was going to be less expensive. And also the financial benefits of some of those tax credits, which were supposed to be passed on to, and seem to be just passed on to the people making some of those wind turbines and some of those solar panels, which, by the way, many times are manufactured in what country? China. So you can see the problem there. So again, the best way to make the grid reliable, to make America energy efficient again, if we can use a phrase that we've heard before, is to simply come back to the free market. Let's let supply and demand work in the energy markets without some of the distortions of mandates and subsidies. And this new bill that is being criticized heavily is actually the solution to the problem, not the problem. And so this is something I'm hoping that you will certainly recognize as you are going to vote for people in the future. I suspect most of my people surrounding me today that live in the state of Alaska understand the importance of energy, but many of the other states in which we are broadcasting are going to be hearing all the problems that were created because this Republican budget bill phased out subsidies for wind and solar, and as a result are going to make the energy and the electricity in the electrical grid more dangerous and probably less substantial. The sheer reality is just the opposite. And again, this particular article, which goes on for 3 pages, put together by the editors of the Wall Street Journal, might be a very good piece for you to obtain. But as you also have probably heard us mention, we have done booklets in the past on the issue of energy production. And of course, when we've had people like Dr. Merrill Matthews on the program and others, we've talked about some of the fallacies that have been promoted for many years, oftentimes even by the mainstream media. So I hope, again, we can be your source for news and information and commentary which you can trust. But if you're looking for a simple read, this 3-page particular article by the editors of the Wall Street Journal, The Real Risk to the Electric Grid, is one I pass on. Just seemed like an appropriate thing to talk about when we're broadcasting today from a very energy-rich state, the state of Alaska. We'll take a break, come back with some more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. I thought we would end with a very good piece by our good friend Robert Knight, and we probably need to get him on again sometime in the future. It appeared in the Washington Times, and of course you can find it on our website, pointofview.net, as the title, Pastors Should Be More Involved in Politics, Not Less. And really what caused the conversation had to do with the fact that back in 1954, Senator Lyndon Johnson, a senator from the state of Texas, actually was able to pass what was called the Johnson Amendment. Now, 6 years before, when he ran for the Senate for the first time, it was a very contested race, ran against Coke Stevens, and actually there is a good deal of evidence that indeed there was a fair amount of voter fraud that allowed Lyndon Johnson to win the first time. Matter of fact, I always love to tell the story about the fact that in one particular county and precinct, everybody voted in perfect alphabetical order, as illustrates the fact that there was some real questions about electoral integrity even back in that particular time in 1948. But in 1954, this time he was running again, and he was facing some nonprofit groups, and so passed what was called the Johnson Amendment. It was passed on a voice vote, was never really seriously considered. It just simply was something that said that a 501c3 nonprofit tax-exempt organization could not get involved in political activity. As Kelly Shackelford, I think, pointed out the other day, I don't even think Lyndon Johnson intended that to actually stifle churches, but nevertheless, the Johnson Amendment has been around since 1954, and just the other day, you finally had both the Trump administration and the IRS come to an agreement that the Johnson Amendment is not going to be implemented. It never really was, but it also sometimes became an excuse for pastors to say, you know, we really can't speak to the political issues. I don't think it would be appropriate to have a voter's guide in the church sanctuary. Wouldn't be good for me to address some of these political issues. But if you think about it, almost every issue is both a moral and political issue. And so even though it was, I think, unconstitutional, it stood until recently, in which the IRS did announce that it would no longer enforce it based upon a case that was brought by the National Religious Broadcasters. So anyway, there's where we are. Now, interestingly enough, a columnist, and he just mentions a columnist, I'll mention the name, was Cal Thomas, because we did actually quote that and give Kelly Shackelford a chance to agree or disagree with some of that. But in some respects, Robert Knight is saying, this columnist was saying that pastors should really stay out of partisan politics. And if by that what you mean is that you should actually not spend any time talking about particular bills or legislation, I think most people would agree that has no place in a congregation or even in a sermon. But at the same time, one of the phrases that I've used so often is, if pastors and Sunday school teachers don't educate churches and Christians about how to think about issues biblically, where are they going to learn that? They're certainly not going to learn that from listening to CNN or MSNBC or ABC or CBS. Those are certainly not going to happen. And so in some respects, we should recognize how important it is to educate people about how to think about these issues. And also, Robert Knight reminds us that when we say, well, pastors should really never talk about that, maybe not even a mention that elections coming up. You then have George Barna pointing out that you had 32 million Christians who actually are sitting in the pews each week, but few refuse to vote. And as a result, he says that it's low-hanging fruit for pastors as they try to motivate their congregations to carry out their civic duty and honor God through their influence for things that matter in our culture. And so, again, Robert Knight reminds us of people that have been speaking to those issues. And, of course, he mentions in the past, whether it was the founder of Focus on the Family, Jim Dobson, the late Jerry Falwell, Reverend Franklin Graham, or some of those. He said, really, without Jerry Falwell's moral majority and some of the others, Ronald Reagan may not have even won the presidential races in 1980. But I think we also recognize that even to this day, we try to bring some very articulate individuals who are pastors to the congregation through the radio so that you could hear from them as well. And so in some respects, what Robert Knight is saying is, if we don't speak to these issues, what's going to happen? And he points out that if you want to see what it's like if we continue to say that pastors shouldn't address the issues, well, then check out, as he said, the Planned Parenthood abortion bill or Public Library's Drag Queen Story Hour. And he says, well, I do have a few questions. These are, again, Robert Knight's. Where in the Bible is there any limit on Jesus' influence in this world? Where does it say that Christian pastors can address any and all sectors of life except public policy? And he reminds us that historically, it's been Christians that have really spoken to most of these issues. If you go to, for example, the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century, he talks about how William Wilberforce was the outspoken Christian in Great Britain's Parliament, having stayed silent. He was not going to stay silent, but instead spoke out from 1790 to 1807 to end the transatlantic slave trade. And I think anybody would have called that a political matter, but yet look at that. By the way, I might highly recommend the book by Eric Metaxas called Amazing Grace that tells you that whole story of that. He goes on to say, what about pastors? Should they have been barred from supporting the abolitionists in the United States before the Civil War, which ended slavery? Again, this idea that they should have stayed in their lane. We're very grateful that they did not. You can talk about pastors who were involved in the civil rights movement and all the civil rights laws and how so many of those were addressing those issues as well. And of course, even to this day, you have pastors that at least have felt the need to address the issue of abortion because of Sanctity of Life Sunday and because of the impact that that has had on that. And so his argument is that, look, congregations look to their clergy for guidance. And if pastors don't mention politics or elections, then it seems to imply to individuals that they're not important. And yet we see every day elections have profound consequences. One of the surveys that George Barna and others did was they were to ask pastors, does the Bible speak to a variety of different social issues? The pastors certainly said they do. Then they asked the congregations of those individuals, would you like to have information and training in some of those issues? And almost without exception, they said, yes, we'd like to know more about some of these moral and social issues. And then when they asked the pastors, well, how many of those issues did you address from the pulpit this last year? With the exception maybe of abortion on Sanctity of Life Sunday, very few addressed any of those others. Now, I recognize that some of the issues are a little more technical. That's one of the reasons why I encourage you to get these booklets that we make available through Point of View. People might not feel free to address some issues like artificial intelligence and a variety of others from the pulpit, but make sure that you get news and information and commentary from reliable sources. We hope that Point of View is one of those, but we also want to encourage those of you pastors out there, you need to educate your congregation so that they know about these issues and know how to apply biblical principles to those as well. Well, that's all we have for this particular edition of Point of View from KJNP, and we certainly appreciate those who've made it possible here to bring this broadcast. I want to thank Megan and Steve back there in Dallas for bringing the program to you. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up, but we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.